So hey everybody, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. Lisa, great to see you again. How's it going? Lisa, great to see you again. How's it going? So, we'll just get started in a few minutes. This is sort of a surprise stream. We'll be talking about some Canadian politics, some American politics. What are people doing for the long weekend? I kind of just wanted to throw the stream up, see what's what. Edit it down later on and post it as a video. When a few more people get here, I'm probably going to talk a bit about some of the goings on with the Fraser Institute. I don't know if you guys saw their report. I was going to make a video on it, but a lot of people have been making some great comments on Twitter and Facebook, and I felt like for a whole video I didn't really have a whole lot to add. So I kind of just want to talk about, their discourse and what that means, and to really, challenge it and talk about how groups like the Fraser Institute really do some pretty awful things and some pretty misleading things when it comes to how they present data and how they interpret data. Joshua, great to see you. Hope you're doing good. You guys got any plans for the long weekend? Working my, yeah, no, I get that. Well, the freelancing, it's sort of like being an academic in some ways. I mean, one, if you're non-tenured, if you're not tenure track or tenured, there's the precarity like a freelancer has in some ways. The good part of a job like working in academia is you get to set your own hours. But the worst thing about working in academia is that you get to set your own hours, which means you always feel like you could or maybe should be working, even when you maybe have done a good day, you always feel you could do more, as opposed to a more traditional 9-to-5 office gig, what have you. Then you punch the clock and you're done for the day. You kind of just can go home and worry about work when you're back at work, right? So I totally get that. Makes sense. Lisa, just hanging out? Yeah, I mean, academia is sort of my full-time thing right now. I might be transitioning out. I don't know what's necessarily going to happen with academic work and all of those sorts of things. Right now, I mean, I'm currently on a postdoctoral fellowship at U of T, largely live in Kingston, Ontario, though. But after that wraps up, there's academic jobs to apply for, but there's not very many of them. I talked about that on a recent stream. The amount of jobs are very few, and the quality of applicants is very high. I'd like to think that I'm on the higher end. I've written a book and all of that, but the reality is that there's just not very many jobs, so I might transition out. Who knows if this YouTube thing will ever become a full-time gig for me or not, I'm not sure, but I'm trying to produce good content that you guys really enjoy. And I have a small fan base, but a pretty loyal one, if I'm being honest, so I'm very happy to see that. A good chunk of you, relative to what a lot of channels get, watch most of my videos. I have a pretty good subscriber turnout, relative to what a lot of channels have. The average chance that a subscriber will watch one of their videos. So, we get. Yeah, I mean, Joshua, you're right. The base is certainly growing. We're getting close to 2,700 subscribers. We have about 37 patrons. Both of those things are pretty good for a channel. Well, 37 patrons for a channel of this size is quite good. There are channels many, many times larger that only have a few times more patrons. And the average donation is fairly good of those patrons, too. All the donations are helpful. Not everyone can give money or could give more, but people have been very generous on a per capita basis, which is fantastic to see. And the channel continues to grow, and we'll see what happens. It kind of goes in waves. The last few days it's grown slower, but then there are weeks where it grows by 70, 80, 90 people a day, and then there are weeks where it grows by 5 or 6 people a day. So it's just about plugging away at YouTube. There's a certain exponentiality to the platform. So yeah, so I just want to kind of quickly talk a bit about this Fraser Institute, the Fraser Institute study. Now this is a really interesting one because it makes the argument that Canadians pay more in taxes than they do for the basic necessities of life. And that this is a problem that started in the 1960s and has only gotten worse and worse and worse as the generations have gone by. Because Canadian governments at the municipal, provincial, and federal level are tax and spend, and they waste your money so that you have less and less money for necessities, and more of it is going to taxes. I don't know if do you guys see this report? You guys see this one? This one is really bad because frankly, it's misleading on both a data and philosophical sense. The big part of it, philosophically right off the bat, is that they determine that anything that's spent as a tax is by definition not a necessity. So that, firefighters or teachers or hospitals or roads or bridges or food inspection or, water purification or garbage removal or the, military defense, and I could go on and on and on and on, all get thrown under the tax pile. And yet, there are many necessities that you and I and other people who aren't watching have that are at least partially covered through their taxes. When you pay taxes to get your health care, that's an expense that you would need regardless. Whether it was paying out of pocket at the hospital or clinic, or whether it was having private health insurance that you paid for, or whether it was private health insurance that your employer paid for and probably lowers your wages to cover the difference, you would be paying for it another way. And so it wouldn't fall under the tax pile, but it would fall under the necessities pile, but it wouldn't really matter. The general pool is the same. Right? The general pool sounds the same. And so in that sense, there really isn't this grand conspiracy that the government's preventing you from getting your necessities. Another factor, I have to kind of just note this one, is how they sort of include things that aren't taxes as taxes. So they include the Canadian pension fund, the Canada Pension Plan contributions and EI contributions as taxes, when they're not taxes. There are issues with EI and how people have difficulty getting access to them, but that's not a tax issue. That's an accessibility issue. But they count those as taxes. And what they also do is they go ahead and take all the taxes paid by Canadian businesses and divide those to each person, suggesting that the taxes corporations pay are actually taxes that you pay directly. They argue that because taxes are passed on to the consumer or the worker in terms of lower wages or higher costs, effectively that's a tax on you. But that's an incredible leap of logic that just doesn't apply. So from my perspective at least, that's another, fib. Another one, and if you guys see the data, another one is that they'll make the case that, the average Canadian family, say an average family makes about $89,000 a year. That's probably a little bit high in most of Canada. The average family probably makes something closer to 70-something or 60-something. They do that, the average two-income family, if you were, pays, like $5,000 a year, $5,000 plus in sales taxes, when if you work that out to the provincial average in a place like Ontario, it's like $45,000 a year in sales taxes, which is just not the case. Because you don't pay sales taxes on everything, you don't really pay sales taxes on key expenditures like rent, and so when you add that all up, they're basically inflating the amount of taxes that an average family making that amount of money would spend. So whether it's including things that aren't taxes as taxes, whether it's including much higher estimations of taxes for the average family, or whether it's making this dichotomy that all taxes are therefore lost necessities, groups like the Fraser Institute will really lie about things. And so in some cases, the individual data points aren't lies, but it's how you interpret the data. And in other cases, they're just outright lying. And again, it starts in 1961 with their frame of reference, but that was before Medicare. And that was before a lot of social programs were created nationwide. So of course, the amount of taxes is higher. And the amount of taxes is also higher on the average family because taxes on corporations are lower than they were back in the 60s, and taxes on rich people haven't kept up with the amount of wealth that rich people have relative to working people. So if you want to ask, are Canadian families overtaxed? I would say probably not, or at least not by a whole lot. But certainly, if we are overtaxed, it's because the burden has gone away from the rich and from the corporations and has gone more towards the working and middle classes. And this is a great example. Yeah, this is a great example of how like right-wing think tanks will seize on people's concerns about cost of living and they'll twist it in a way to make an anti-government argument. And the Fraser Institute has connections to the Koch brothers, the famous Koch brothers from the United States. And they clearly have a desire here to mislead people about the nature of taxation and the realities of taxation. And the Fraser Institute, again, this isn't just me trying to drag a right-wing think tank because they did a bad study just to get you guys to watch and so we can all just, agree with one another about how good we are and how bad they are. The reality is that they have incredible amounts of influence, and mainstream media, respectable sources in mainstream media, will cite the Fraser Institute, often uncritically, often without the work that I'm saying right now, without research by the Broadbent Institute or the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives or the Progressive Economics Forum, sort of left-wing think tanks and groups which have examined the flawed assumptions of this study. They're not replicated in the actual mainstream report. So the mainstream media will report on the study and it'll get shared around, and there's no critical thinking done to challenge the Fraser Institute on this one, right? And so I think it's important that we all talk about it. If you go to Twitter right now, and this is a good thing, and you look up the study, you'll see a whole bunch of thoughtful critiques from people saying, well, there's nobody who makes that amount of money paying that amount in sales tax. Or the average Canadian family paying $4,800 a year in taxes on profit probably isn't the case because most Canadians don't make nearly that kind of money on capital gains or investments, even a sort of upper middle class family. Or it's the assumption around the taxes versus necessities. And Joshua, you make a great point here. You say, if the people saw the improvements from these taxes, perhaps we wouldn't have the PPC growing amongst some communities. And I think you're right, but this isn't just the PPC. This is like the argument the Tories will make. The Tories will make a similar argument. The Tories will take this and say, under Justin Trudeau, your taxes have gone up and your ability to afford the necessities you and your children need have gone down. Vote Andrew Scheer and he'll flip the switch on this and put more money in your pockets. When the reality is that conservative governments don't actually reduce tax burdens. They just cut services for those who need them on the one hand, and they often cut taxes on those who could afford to pay more. But the narrative can hold, and the narrative goes to people. And the PPC growing, I think, is interesting, but I don't know if the PPC is growing because of taxation. A lot of Bernier's original support, when he almost won the Conservative leadership, I think included some anti-government folks, some traditional libertarian types. But I really think that Bernier's support is being driven by racism and xenophobia, and by hatred of specific groups like Muslims. I think that's the biggest factor driving Bernier's support. I don't think that he's getting any significant kind of libertarian support, at least not right now. Because I think that all the discussions around his party, what Bernier has been talking about much more than taxes. I mean, he's talked a bit about supply management. Bernier has spent his most time, one, denying climate change, and two, attacking the so-called politically correct left who won't talk about the realities of how European Canadians are great and how Canada is a distinct society and we have to keep it that way, and on and on and on. He's actually spending relatively little time talking about taxes and and small government. And in fact, Bernier wants to increase government. He wants to have the state build a giant fence across our entire border, one of the longest borders in the world. He also wants Canadian immigration officials to do interviews of every single immigrant applicant, every single one, to do an in-person, one-on-one interview. That's going to require a massive increase in staff of the government. So he wants, so I don't think Bernier is necessarily running on a small government platform, at least not right now. Lisa, that's a great point. Lisa says Alberta does not have a provincial sales tax. We are under the secret tax because those taxations are hidden. Would having a PSD provide more transparency for us in Alberta? I think it would. I think that it would give a better sense of what things cost, and I think it would deal with a lot of Alberta's issues. Look, the sales tax is a real tricky subject for us on the left, because sales taxes are regressive. Sales taxes apply on a percent basis, whether you're rich or you're poor or you're middle class. And we do offer GST rebates here in Canada, but they still affect people in a non-progressive manner. Whether you make $50,000 a year or you make $500,000 a year, you pay the same amount of sales tax as a proportion. A rich person might pay more sales tax because they buy more things, not because it's a progressive system. On the other hand, the sales tax is amongst the most effective and efficient and simple ways of raising revenue, the sort of revenue you need to provide social programs and services. So, I think the left needs to embrace sales taxes more, but with much heavier rebates for lower income people, and rebates given out more frequently, not just every 3 months, but every month, let's say, to be rolled into a general, support payment for low income people. Because I think sales taxes are good. But that goes to another point of this study. It's saying, well, the average family, the sales taxes, they calculate it. I wonder if in this study they reckon that, the average tax burden for somebody in Alberta is less because they don't pay a sales tax, or if they take the Ontario average and they apply it to an Alberta family, which would be misleading because, again, Alberta does not have a provincial sales tax. David, I think that's a great point. This idea that the media is full of very rich people. I think that's fair, but it's not purely conspiratorial. I have a bit of sense sometimes that we need to be more critical of a class-conscious nature of our media and how it serves the interest of the elite at the expense of regular people. Totally agree. But I think it's partially driven by the fact that the Fraser Institute gives this content to the media sources, and media sources are overworked. A lot of journalists are very much overworked, and they're very much underpaid. And I think sometimes it's just a matter of, here's this ready-made study that I can make a report on, and then that's an article. I got to write 4 articles today, and that's a quick one. Fraser Institute says we spend more on necessities, or on taxes than necessities. Here's some of their data points. Here's a thing I can note. Done. Story. Copy sent to my editor, and move on. So in some cases, it's not just malice, but it's the nature of our media system right now, which is that journalists are so spread thin that sometimes what you get in media is in effect press releases from organizations, that become journal articles, media articles, newspaper articles, website articles, and I think that's a really troubling sign. But it's also a manifestation of the precarity and poverty of too many journalists, most journalists. No, David, I agree. Maybe conspiratorial was a strong word. I think my point was that there's certainly a bias amongst our media, and it's a purposeful one, in favor of the social and economic elite. Whether that's the Toronto Star, or the National Post, or the Toronto Sun, or any of Post Media's papers, they all have a general bias against, the sort of vision that, say, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP want to provide. And sometimes more than others. I mean, the Star is more centrist than those other papers. And it does have some good people doing good journalism there. And those other sources actually have the isolated journalist that does good journalism and good commentary. But on the whole, there's not a whole lot of voices on the left in mainstream Canadian media. It's actually one of the reasons why, ironic as it is, the Canadian left has more writers in some ways at the Washington Post than we do at any of the major Canadian newspapers. People like myself and Nora Loretto and David Moscrop, we've all written at Washington Post. David and Nora write more regularly for the Post than I do. But I've written there about 3 times now. And I've written for the Washington Post more than I've written for any Canadian newspaper. I've written for the Globe and Mail once. I've never written for the Star. I've never written for the National Post. I've obviously never written for the Sun. But I've written for the Washington Post. And it's because, in some ways, they're more willing to cover left-wing Canadian issues than our own papers are. And isn't that kind of sad? Chances that Marianne Williamson... That's a chances that Marianne Williamson will make the second debate. I mean, I'm not sure. Looking at the data from after the last debate, it seemed like, there's, I think, 7 people locked in for the next debate, and there's a few that have a chance. I think, like, Andrew Yang could make it. Kirsten Gillibrand might make it. I don't know if Williamson's going to make it. I don't know if she's going to be able to do it. I think that the first debate for her was sort of embarrassing, if we're being honest. And then she went on Dave Rubin's show and sort of destroyed him and got a lot of credibility back. And while she was still kind of kooky in the last debates, earlier this week, she, to her credit, also made some good remarks. But I don't know what her niche is. And I sort of feel like, unless you're one of the big dogs, unless you're one of the big 5 or 6 or 7. I really think there's 5 big candidates. There's Sanders, Biden, Warren, Harris, and Buttigieg are the big 5. And then Beto O'Rourke maybe is 6. Cory Booker maybe is 7. Those are the kind of ones that I think have locked their tickets or will. If you're not one of those people, you need to have a niche. And whether that niche is geographic or demographic or issue-based, you need to have a niche if you want to survive. So Andrew Yang is the only Asian American running at this stage, and I think that isn't a major issue, but probably doesn't hurt because he fits a demographic that's underrepresented at that level of politics. And I think another factor is he's running on this basic income idea, and whether you agree with his idea or not, or whether you like basic income but not Andrew Yang's representation, or whether him saying not left, not right, but forward just makes you cringe. The reality is he's got a niche. And so I think Andrew Yang will end up in the next debates. Somebody like Klobuchar or somebody like Jay Inslee, they have niches as well. They have regional niches, which could give them support. Or Inslee has both a regional niche, but also he's sort of building himself as the Green New Deal, the environmentalist candidate. And so if you can do that, I think you can find your way into the next round. I don't see that for Williamson. I just don't. I sort of feel like if there's going to be a person like Tulsi Gabbard, I feel, has a decent chance of making the next round, but I don't think Williamson will. I don't think so. Yeah, the post-millennial is has good branding. Because it's not immediately evident that it's like a right-wing source. It's not called like sjwwatch.com or, keepcanadacaucasian.ca or something like that. But it's really a right-wing source. And it's very much antagonistic to people on the left, both politically and socially. It attacks individual non-politicians on social media. And, it allegedly plants itself as something saying that, we're a sort of moderate source that covers issues important to young people, but it's very clearly right-wing. And I think that they've been successful at getting their content shared in a mainstream way, but as they become more prominent, I think people will get a greater sense for their ideology. Lisa, you make a great point there, that the debates were, there was a lot more attacking in the second night than the first night. I totally agree with you. And I noted that in my debate recap. That the first night there was attacks, but they seemed more formalized. Like, there was ideological disagreements between the people, and they got a little heated, but it never really got personal. The last debate, it sort of got personal. And one of the reasons I feel like that debate had more attacking was because more of the candidates on the stage had had nothing or very little to lose. If you remember the first night, the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and Beto O'Rourke were on the stage. Those are considered to be candidates with something of a chance of winning this. Now, I think O'Rourke is sort of done. I think he's plateaued and is going to dip away. But if you remember, Beto O'Rourke got this big media profile. And in a sense, him and Buttigieg are both polling in and around 10%, maybe a little bit higher. And they've both qualified for the next round of debates. So there were 4 candidates in the first debate with 10% or more. In the last debate, in the one the next night, only Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were polling above 10, but even further, only Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were polling above 5. So put another way, everybody else on that stage was polling below 5%. Some of them as low as 1, but some of them, close to 5, like Cory Booker was basically at about 5%. That means there's a whole bunch of people on that stage that knew they had to swing for the fences, or otherwise this was their last debate. And then you had Kamala Harris and Joe Biden as the only 2 main candidates on the stage. And Joe Biden even having more than double the support in some polls than Kamala Harris. So it made sense that those 2 got attacked much more than on the first night, where there were really 4 mainstream candidates running. And I think another factor is that Sanders and Warren were the 2 main contenders on the first night, and they didn't take the bait and attack one another. Whereas Harris and Biden went after one another really quite frequently. And they went after other people went after them. And I think because the main 2 candidates sort of were willing to go after one another, it set the whole tone for the debate, which is that it was kind of a rumble. Joshua, yeah, your point about the conservatives, they seem to be losing face over the past few weeks and are not looking good to their base. I mean, I think they're looking good to their base. The question is, are they looking good to the extra 10, 11, 8, 9, whatever % of Canadians they need to actually win this? And I think what you're seeing happening is that, Trudeau had a pretty good go of it going into 2019. In fact, it was looking pretty likely he was going to win another majority. He was polling at the low end in the mid-30s, but in some cases as high as like the low 40s. But SNC happened. Jody Wilson-Raybould scandal happened. Jane Philpott happened. Selina Cesar-Chavannes happened. All of these things happened to Justin Trudeau, and his numbers tanked. His personal numbers tanked, and his party's numbers tanked. But I think some people, at least, not everyone, have sort of moved away from that issue, and so you've seen a bit of a return to normal. Conservative numbers have dropped and liberal numbers have rebounded in that sense. And that's why we are where we are, which is that both of those parties are in the low mid-30s on average, and this is why it's looking very likely that we're seeing a minority government. In fact, it could be a pretty interesting one where both the liberals and conservatives are under 150 seats, which would mean that not only is it a minority, neither of them are anywhere close to a majority and would need the support of, say, the NDP to get it over the hump, because the Greens, if they have 5 or 6 seats, won't be enough. The Bloc won't be enough. The NDP is projected right now, depending on the projections, somewhere in the mid-20s to low 30s, depending on their projection. So the NDP would be the only party that could have a balance. So I think you're right that Scheer has lost a bit of momentum. I think Doug Ford has hurt him. Doug Ford has hurt him, especially in Ontario. But because Doug Ford is known countrywide, I wouldn't be surprised if Doug Ford has hurt the Conservatives in other parts of the country too. But it's not all bad for Scheer. Scheer's doing much better amongst Quebec than he did before. His numbers in Atlantic Canada are rebounded from where they were from the Conservatives in 2015. So it's not all doom and gloom for Scheer, but it is the case that the momentum is slowing. Kamala Harris, yeah. I mean, who was the biggest loser on each night? And on the first night, I don't know if anyone really lost. I would say Beto O'Rourke was probably the loser on the first night, because he was really invisible. For somebody who is amongst the people who's going to be in the next debates and has 10% polling and has, good donor numbers, he was just invisible. And I can't imagine it was a conspiracy against him. I think the mainstream media would love Beto O'Rourke as their candidate because they, at the end of the day, want a mainline centrist who is going to talk progressive but then run as a neoliberal or govern as a neoliberal. And I think he really lost. And I think centrism lost on the first night because Warren and Sanders wiped the floor with Delaney and Ryan and Hickenlooper and what have you. It was a massacre. Now, the second night, again, I don't think any of the bottom candidates could lose. They're already sub 5. They're already sub 5%. Most of them aren't going to qualify for the next round. So for them, it was all gravy. And so I think both Biden and Harris lost. Both of them lost because they were unable to parry the attacks against them. Bernie and Liz, in that first debate, knew they were going to be attacked. And they did it. They came out of that debate, I think, looking stronger. Like you take a piece of metal and you put it in a fire, you temper it. And by damaging it in a way, you make it stronger. And Warren and Sanders came out of that forge stronger. They came out of that fight stronger. Biden and Harris, on the other hand, didn't perform that well. The way Harris responded to Tulsi Gabbard so dismissively after was really troubling. And I think it made her look sort of too cool for school, not treating Tulsi Gabbard as a legitimate opponent. And whether or not you will say, well, Tulsi's polling at like 2%, so whatever. I think that she was on that stage and her remarks to Harris were valid. And I think that the criticisms of Biden from a lot of people on the stage, whether it was Cory Booker or Kamala Harris or whether it was Marianne Williamson, there was a lot of criticism of the elites on that stage, and I think they hit really well. Bill de Blasio has got no chance of winning this. Yet the way he ate away at Biden all night, he would almost play debate moderator. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you guys recognize this, but he basically said, like, I mean, I don't really have an opinion on this, but I'd love to know what the vice president thinks. I'd love to know what Mr. Biden thinks. Knowing that, like, Biden doesn't want to speak on that issue because it makes him look bad, because you have to bring up the fact that he supported segregationists or what have you. And I think that it was a really bad night for those two. So I think that coming out of this debate, Biden and Harris are going to slip, and Warren and Sanders are at least going to maintain and maybe gain. And I think that's just the nature of the debate. But what I'm really looking forward to is a debate where all the big dogs are on the same stage. That's when it's really going to matter. You're going to have a few small candidates on the stage, but once the big 5 or 6 are all together is when you're really going to see some fireworks. David, I think Christo Aivalis has got the best editorial. I mean, I'm not sure. I think your thing got cut off there, but thank you. I mean, I do try to provide good editorial comment both here on YouTube, but also through my writing. I don't know if you guys, I put a community post about it, but I don't know if you guys saw that I had a recent article in the Washington Post, which really builds on a lot of what I've been saying in my videos, which is that the NDP has a bold plan for a Green New Deal. It's a plan that is going to help working class people. It's going to help people transition into a new society. So whether I'm on here or whether it's in writing, I try to provide content that you guys and others find helpful. So it's glad to hear that. And I always appreciate your compliments. You guys are actually really good at, just saying like, great job. And I really read those and I love that. So I really appreciate your support. The monetary support people provide through Super Chats and through Patreon and those sorts of things. But really just you guys just, being so supportive, it means a lot to me. It really does. Yeah, Lisa, that's definitely something I've noticed too. There's I think a desire from certain elements in the media to take what are fair points, that the NDP is struggling in some ways, and then ignore all the ways that are positive, which is that we're getting young, diverse, incredibly qualified candidates, that some polling companies put us at the level of support that we were in 2015, like Ipsos and Nanos and Angus Reid, or very close to it like Abacus that has us at 16, 17. And they ignore all of that to create this narrative that the NDP is dead. And I think they're doing that because they don't want actual Canadians to look at the NDP platform. They're hoping that if they just say the NDP is irrelevant, people won't look at the Green New Deal, people won't look at our wealth tax, people won't look at the universal dental and pharmacare, and they'll just forget about the NDP. And I don't know if it's going to work, but I think some elements in the media are hoping it'll work. Alex, I mean, I think, why do you think that the right to repair aren't a larger left-wing plank in more rural areas? I think that in some ways, and this is a criticism of the left, is that we don't have a whole lot of rural voices in our party. And that's because we don't elect a lot of people from those areas, so we don't have a lot of voices, and therefore we don't elect a lot of people, and it's sort of a vicious cycle, right, of why don't we have more rural voices. And I think that there are some ways that we really do need to find ways to sell our socialist ideology to rural people. Because don't forget, it was Canada's socialism was born in rural areas. The CCF for a long time was basically only strong in Saskatchewan and other parts of the prairies, and in some mining communities, like resource extraction town, like in Cape Breton, for instance. The CCF would be very strong in the 40s and 50s. The reality is that we don't have a lot of expertise there. Now, Andrea Horwath has made here in Ontario, has made one of her leaders, her co-leaders, John Van Thoth, who does represent a rural riding and has those rural concerns. And I think there's an effort for that. I think another reality is that in Canada, at least, and maybe this applies in the US with the House of Representatives, is that the first past the post system makes it very, very resource inefficient for left-leaning parties to target rural areas. There's no value in me, in the NDP, let's say, gaining an extra 1,000 votes in rural Alberta. It is absolutely 100% irrelevant. We can say that it shouldn't be like that. Politicians will never admit that because it makes them look bad. But the reality is that an extra NDP vote in rural Saskatchewan or Alberta or in rural Ontario is 100% meaningless. Because the only difference is the Conservatives will win, but by one less vote. An extra 10% support for the non-conservative option in some of these ridings is not enough. They win some of these ridings with 60-70% support. So if you make a big platform out of right to repair and you really try to push and go to farming communities and communities where people have to, do a lot of handiwork themselves and therefore have a lot of machines that they have to fix themselves or wish they could to save money, the reality is that those voters coming to you won't make a difference. And this is another reason, I've talked about this, this is another reason why I support proportional representation. Because I feel that it'll give more representation to people who don't have the same ideological views as their neighbors. So right now, if you're a conservative in the most urban parts of Toronto, you don't really elect MPs. And in the kind of areas where it's the NDP versus the Liberals. Or if you're a Liberal in much of the prairies, you don't elect MPs in places like, Saskatchewan. The NDP might elect people, the Liberals don't. Or if you're a NDP or a Liberal, or especially an NDP, or if you're a Green in the middle of rural areas in Ontario, it doesn't matter. Maybe the North is different. The northern rural people are different. But the reality is that at the end of the day, those people's votes are lost. Under a proportional system, though, the NDP being able to say, look, we normally get X amount of percent in Alberta, but if we can reach enough rural people with something like a right to repair bill, maybe we can get an extra 2 or 3 points across all those rural areas, and that adds up to 1 or 2 more seats nationwide. And then it's worth it. Now it's not worth it. And I know that sounds terrible, but it's just not worth it. You know? Dan Mindell, TFC sucks. I mean, I have to disagree. I'm a big TFC fan. I grew up in the Maritimes, but my dad, when he immigrated to Canada, my dad immigrated from Greece, lived in Toronto for a while, so he was always a big fan of the Leafs and the Blue Jays. TFC didn't exist back then, so I've always been a kind of Toronto sports fan, and now that I live in Southern Ontario, it's even more geographically close. So now I'm a big TFC fan. I was actually at the game where they won the championship in 2017. My wife and I and my son were going to a game later this month, so very excited for that. But TFC decidedly does not suck. Joshua, I mean, how do we make it connect with the average person that voting for the wrong policy is literally voting against themselves? I mean, if I had the answer to that, then I would be leader of the NDP right now, and I would be preparing to form a majority government as we usher in socialism into Canada. You know what I mean? I don't have the full answer. I think that one of the challenges is that people are complex, and that people have a multifaceted understanding of their interests. And so for some people, maybe a religious conservative, for instance, they might understand that voting for the Conservatives will hurt their pocketbook. But that at the end of the day, they hate an aspect of social liberalism so much that it's worth it to them. It's worth it to them to go against their own economic self-interest, because they feel their spiritual self-interest or their cultural self-interest is more valuable. And I mean, maybe that's not the case with all conservative voters, but I think that's a factor. That when we define self-interest, we have to be very broad with it. Because here's the thing, it doesn't happen a whole lot, but there are some NDPers who vote NDP even though it's against some aspects of their self-interest. I mean, there are some, if you're a professor, and a lot of academics vote NDP, they vote Liberal and NDP, a lot of them, but proportionally, academics can be NDPers. You might make $130,000, $140,000 a year, maybe more. The NDP might not be the best party for your financial self-interest, and yet you still vote for them because you believe in the values, you believe in what they'll do for others, you believe in the society they want to provide. So politics isn't just purely about raw self-interest, it's also about beliefs and whatnot going forward. And I can tell you one thing, if I win the Lotto 649, I'm still voting NDP, and I'm voting NDP for the rest of my goddamn life, right? It doesn't matter that I'm suddenly a rich guy, at least personally, I'm going to start voting conservative or liberal, and I'm going to start opposing things like a wealth tax. You know what I mean? So that's kind of one of my perspectives. Now, I think one of the ways is you just got to get the policies to the people. Part of the challenge for the NDP is that people like what we do, but they don't like our brand. And I don't know what the solution is to that in the immediate term, but you just got to get ideas to people. And I've made this example before. The wealth tax. The wealth tax is popular in every province, with men and women, with every generation, but with older people more than young people, which is curious, considering that old people are more likely to have wealth. It's even popular with the vast majority of NDPers, Liberals, and Greens, and even a majority of Conservatives. And for people who identify as left, they support it. People who identify as center, they support it. And people who identify as right, they support it. So that means that a majority of conservative voters in this country support a wealth tax along the lines of Jagmeet Singh's wealth tax. So what does that mean? It means we have to get that wealth tax idea to people and explain to them why it's important. I think it helps sometimes when you sell some of our positions in ways that reach groups that don't normally vote for us. Now, this didn't ultimately work in the Ontario election. It didn't. But I think it was a good tactic. Andrea Horwath sold our pharmacare and dental care plan not just as a government program that, would help, the marginalized, which is kind of like an NDP selling point. But she went to small business people and had meetings with small business people and said, look, you can't provide your workers with benefits. You might want to, but you can't. If you have 10 employees, you might not have the economies of scale to provide good benefits. And in fact, if you're a small business owner, you may not even have benefits yourself. So a public plan helps small businesses. It means that their workers don't have to worry about leaving that job to go to a big company to get benefits. And so that these people now have a better ability to compete with for the best workers. That they can keep wages where they are and and their workers will see value increases. And so I think in some ways, it's about selling these visions to different elements of the population. A wealth tax sold to rural conservatives could be about taxing the downtown elite in Toronto. They think the downtown elite are all like socialists, but they're not. They're some of the richest people in the country, live in the downtowns of the biggest cities. Maybe go to rural Saskatchewan and say, hey, the people in Toronto who work on the stock market and at the big banks who push paper for a living, they don't know what it's like to really work like you or I. Let's tax the rich Torontonians and make it almost like take the kind of anti-Toronto, anti-Montreal, anti-downtown Vancouver populism and turn it against the right. That atheist bastard. In hindsight, should the NDP have foresaw the collapse in Quebec coming given the actual party membership in the province? I mean, I'm not a harbinger, I'm not a soothsayer, so I can't know if we should have predicted it or if this was 100% predictable. But I do think it's a reasonable point to note that the growth in Quebec was very fast and very sudden, and there wasn't necessarily density to that growth. Put another way, it was sort of like a balloon. It can expand quite quickly, but there's not a lot of density in the balloon. That doesn't mean that there could have been anything done to prevent this, and it doesn't necessarily mean that things are over. Again, I have to keep saying this. The polling numbers in Quebec aren't great. Polling numbers in English Canada for Jagmeet Singh are actually pretty decent. And in some cases, looking at some of the better polls, he's beating Mulcair in English Canada. He's losing seats in Quebec. And he's losing votes in Quebec. But the election isn't over yet. And Jagmeet Singh, when he goes to Quebec, is well received. When he was on Tout le monde en parle, he was well received. And I really feel like we shouldn't be discounting the actual events of the election. Because again, in 2011, Jack Layton was polling below 15% with 3 weeks to go. And in 2015, Justin Trudeau was in third place for much of that election. And so a lot can happen. But I do think it's fair to say that with the rapid growth in Quebec, there was always the risk that growth couldn't be consolidated. And I think that's a fair point. And this is the case whenever you win a seat that you're not expected to win, because it's like a protest vote or people are going to a party for the first time, there's always that challenge to hold on to a seat. Like, the incumbent always has an advantage, but the incumbency only really has an advantage when the riding is culturally situated. So, for example, the Liberals won all 32 seats in the Maritimes, every single one, in the 4 Atlantic provinces. But some of those ridings, the Liberals almost never win. And so you have to ask yourself, is that a fluke victory? And the people are just gonna go back to the Conservatives, and there's nothing you can really do. I think sometimes that's the case, right? There are some rural ridings in New Brunswick that narrowly went Liberal, and they usually heavily go Conservative. So it's almost a guarantee that they'll go back to the Conservatives, especially when the polls are tied. Yeah, Vince, Toronto Croatia was first. There was also Toronto Blizzard. Toronto's got a long history of soccer, but, I mean, I am glad to see Toronto FC, kind of bring a quote-unquote big league profile to soccer in Toronto. BMO Field's a beautiful stadium. It's a beautiful soccer-specific stadium. With the World Cup coming to Canada, BMO Field's going to be even better. And now with the Canadian Premier League, I'm very happy about seeing that even like smaller cities in Canada are getting soccer teams. Like Halifax having like a Canadian Premier League team is great. And I don't know if you guys saw, maybe you guys don't follow soccer. This might be inside info for a lot of you who don't follow soccer. But the Canadian Premier League is sort of below the MLS, and it's only Canadian teams. And they have a tournament called the Canadian Championship, which includes teams from both the MLS, aka the three teams, the Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, but it also includes these smaller teams like Hamilton, Vancouver, Halifax, Calgary. And in this tournament, Calgary beat Vancouver. So in the next round, one of the teams is actually from a lower league, showing that there's this potential for soccer to grow really deep and wide across Canada. It's very exciting. Dan, good question. What I was saying there was one about why would I imply the CPC was endangering those rights. On the one hand, I do feel that some of their rhetoric will lead to political issues which could lead to the dehumanization of folks. I don't think they're in the same ballpark as Maxime Bernier, but at the end of the day, the way that the CPC has talked about certain groups gives me concern. And what we've seen from governments like those in Alberta is that they will attack groups like LGBTQ people. And I don't know if Andrew Scheer will do that. He hasn't made that indication yet, but I have concerns. But what I was more trying to say is that Elizabeth May said she would compromise on literally everything except the environment, which I took as a saying that, say, hypothetically, Andrew Scheer wanted to privatize healthcare. I'm not saying he's going to do that, but let's say hypothetically he was. Elizabeth May would support him doing that if he worked with her on the environment. So my point was more, if you imagine Andrew Scheer as the most right-wing you can imagine him, then what does it say about Elizabeth May when she said she would support him? That was more my point. It was actually more about May than Scheer. But I do have concerns about some of the conservative rhetoric and about the conservative actions in certain provinces. I do have concerns. So I'm just going to scroll up here a little bit. Hammock Lady, what do you think about Philpott and Raybold's chances in the upcoming election? I think Philpott's in a real tough go. I'm going to say she's got a very small chance of winning. The profile she has and the story around her and the fact that she's very personally accomplished will help. But her riding is kind of a traditionally conservative riding. So it's going to be real tricky for her to hold that one as an independent. Not only will some liberal voters still vote liberal because of the brand, but there will be a lot of conservative votes. So I think she's going to lose. Wilson Raybould is much more interesting. That's a stronger riding for the Liberals, and she's got a bigger profile than Philpott. And the story of SNC revolved around her a lot more. Philpott was more a kind of supporting actor in that movie, if you will. Wilson Raybould was like the main star. And so I think she has a much better chance. The riding is better, her profile is bigger, her story is more engaging, and in the polls I've seen, they've actually done a kind of, the polling aggregators have included a Jody Wilson-Raybould counter. And what some have indicated is that she's right on the cusp of winning. I've seen some polls saying she would, and I've seen some people say that when you add in all the disadvantages of being an independent, it might leave her short of the election total. But I think she's got a chance of winning. I do. The Almighty Huge? Yeah, you're right. One of the biggest downside to Jagmeet Singh right now, in some ways, is he's not very well known. but it's also his biggest potential upside. Jagmeet Singh is, in recent polls I've seen, say from Abacus, because they do a pretty regular chart of this, is improving in his popularity and is not really in the negatives. I've seen a lot of polls put him in and around, a neutral approval rating, which is better than Trudeau and Scheer. The challenge is he's not very well known. And I feel that if he gets more people to know him, when he goes places, he generally leaves a good impression. So it's going to be important that he gets people to know him in Quebec. One challenge is, of course, the religious symbols ban is popular in a lot of Quebec. And Jagmeet Singh does not support that, and indeed, it would be a violation of his rights, I believe. His own personal rights. So it puts him in a tough position. But the NDP has positions that are popular in Quebec. For instance, the NDP is the only party that's really been pushing to tax Netflix. And that might seem like a niche issue, but in Quebec, they actually really hate the fact that companies like Netflix, one, don't have to produce francophone content, and two, don't even have to pay taxes, while Canadian companies do. And so Jagmeet Singh has made that clear, whereas both Trudeau and Scheer have been very reluctant to actually make a lot of these, e-commerce businesses pay sales taxes. The very sales taxes that small businesses and big corporations that are Canadian have to pay. Yeah, the Almighty Huge, they liked Mulcair and Layton, but they just don't know Jagmeet. And I think that's a good point. But they didn't really know Jack at the start of 2011. They didn't really know him. I mean, they got help a little bit because the NDP won the 2008 by-election in Outremont with Mulcair. So for the first time in a long time, the NDP had a seat in Quebec. But at the end of the day, Jack Layton really only became, well-known in Quebec during the actual writ period. And that's when he sparked up in support. That's where the NDP wave came from. It was largely in Quebec. It was largely in Quebec and in some other parts of the country where the NDP grew. It wasn't a national wave, because if it was a national wave, the NDP either would have won or Harper would have gotten a minority. Because at the end of the day, the wave sort of petered out in Quebec. But Layton wasn't known either. Layton wasn't known either in Quebec at that point. Not as much as Mulcair was. Maybe more than Jagmeet because he had been leader since 2003, but he was relatively unknown in Quebec. How big of a bump will Bernie get? Joel loves history. I love history too. He asks, "Hey Christo, love your analysis. How big of a bump do you think Bernie got after his debate performance on Tuesday?" That's a good question. I would say it's probably a few points, but I mean I don't want to throw out specific numbers. My general view is that Bernie and Warren came out looking pretty good. Biden and Harris came out looking pretty bad. Some of the smaller candidates like Tulsi Gabbard, again, I don't agree with Tulsi on everything. I think she's got some troubling views on Hindu nationalism and whatnot. But she kind of made a name for herself and stood out. And she might see a bump. You might see Beto O'Rourke slip back a little bit. Andrew Yang, I think, might get a mini bump because he didn't speak a whole lot. But when he did, he sort of got reactions from the audience. But I think that you're going to see a narrowing of the gap between Bernie and Biden. And you might see Harris fall a bit back from Warren in that race for third. And I think that could be what I might see. But then again, like Biden slipped in the polls after the first debate, but sort of got it back over the next few weeks. So that could happen again. The debate could cause a shift, but people could sort of fall back into a holding pattern. I think unless there's major scandals from a candidate, or unless somebody drops out and then their support shifts, the real test is going to be when the debates enter, one debate where everybody's on the stage at the same time. That's when I think it's going to be more seriously taken by people. Adam B., I installed seating at BMO Field Solidarity Local 27 Carpenters Union. Great work. It's always great to see all the things that union people provide. I mean, one of the challenges for me last year, actually, my wife and I had tickets to an FC game during the X last year, but IATSE members were on strike, and we don't cross picket lines, so we didn't go. We had our tickets, so we were very cognizant of the fact that exhibition Exhibition Place, the grounds are union space, and they were on strike, so we wouldn't cross the line. And actually, during I think Caravana that year, or during TFC, the Liberal Party crossed the picket line, and I know the NDP didn't. And during Labor Day, I don't believe the line was crossed either. So it's good to see that work gets done, and this year that there's not a strike during the game. Lisa says, when Rick Mercer has his show on CBC, had his show, his interview with Jagmeet Singh was really the first time I understood Jagmeet's vision. I love the bicycle to work thing. No, I think you're right. I think he just needs to get into more people's consciousness. I think that's a big factor. And when that happens, people will like him. And a lot of people made fun of the cycling policy. And it would be something to roll my eyes at if that was all he was talking about. But just, people, a couple weeks before, Jagmeet Singh had this big policy announcement of a Green New Deal. And I do think encouraging active transportation, whether it's cycling or walking, and building cities that work with that is a good thing. It's a good thing for public health. It's a good thing for small businesses. It's a good thing for communities. Communities where kids can walk to school, that's generally a good thing socially for children. If children can walk to school, they have better social and educational outcomes. There's a whole bunch of varieties of that. Building bikeable and walkable communities, I think, is really important. And I think that might seem as a niche issue, but it's going to be, I think, an important part of a Green New Deal strategy. Because, it's about electric cars, and it's about free public transit, but it's also about active transit when it's feasible. Dan Mindell, you should get Days In. I don't even know how to say it. Days In. I haven't gotten it yet. I'll probably look into getting it. I mean, I found it very interesting how they got the exclusive Canadian rights to the Champions League, which was very interesting because you'd think like it was usually held by either either Sportsnet or TSN, but now it being held by an online streaming service is very interesting. So it'll be. I'd love to know if they've been successful or not. Business-wise, in getting subscriptions, because I haven't subscribed yet. Alex says, am I alone in thinking if the Liberals lose their majority in the election, even if it is because more NDP Green votes, people in the media will say it's due to the rise in right-wing populism? I mean, I think that's probably a fair point, Alex. I think the rise of right-wing populism is important, and we need to talk about it, but I think populism has become a boogeyman for centrist elites because they just don't want to admit that the system as it exists isn't working for the vast majority of people. And this is where you get, for example, the Bernie and Donald Trump are just the same. They're both crazy populists, and they don't understand the realities, and they're both just stoking people's anger and emotions. And they try to equate left-wing populism and right-wing populism. And so I think that using the P word, populism, just allows centrists to blame their own failings on the fact that people are not happy with things the way they are. And while I can be very dismayed by the fact that people see the system as broken and then they go to the far right, I can at least acknowledge that they're not wrong in saying the system is broken. And that there are alternatives, and some of those alternatives are from the left. So I agree that the narrative that the Liberals are following doing the right-wing populism will be one of them, but I don't know if the data really bores that out. If the election happens today and the Liberals become a minority government or the Conservatives edge them out, the Conservatives will have only gained a few percent from the last election. So it wasn't really a rise of the right, but rather, the NDP basically holding steady and maybe losing a couple points, and the rise of the Green Party and the return of the Bloc, that because of vote share splits led to Liberals' losses of seats. And it wouldn't be this big narrative. Now, if Maxime Bernier's party ends up with 10%, then you maybe could make a clearer case that it was a right-wing populist message. But Maxime Bernier at 10% probably doesn't win a whole lot of seats and does a lot of damage to the Conservatives. Vince asks, Are the federal NDP taking full advantage of the Doug Ford screw-ups in Ontario? I think the Ontario NDP is doing a good job. I think that they're the most effective opposition this province has seen in a long, long time. They're the largest official opposition this province has seen, so it means that they have a lot of good, talented, diverse MPs speaking on these issues. And I think that, the Liberal Party in this province is not really doing a job of opposition. The Liberals have 7 MPPs, and 3 of them are on their way out before the next election. One of them just retired. She was an MP from Ottawa, Vanier, to become take up a position at U of T. Kathleen Wynne is going to leave at some point. She's made a point that she's going to leave at some point, likely when she feels that her party has a chance of winning that seat again. And another MP from Orléans is planning on leaving if she wins the federal nomination for the Liberals. So if she wins that, she'll resign her seat. That's 43%, I think, of the Liberal caucus is resigning, is on their way out in Ontario. And the Green Party here is just one guy. And Mike Schreiner is just one guy. And he voted with Doug Ford against the rights of workers. So did Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals. They're the only opposition in this province. Now, the challenge right now is the NDP are shown probably picking up some seats in downtown Toronto, but they're not benefiting generally from the Ford screw-ups. The Ontario NDP is doing a good job at galvanizing some support, and a lot of the polls that show the Liberals leading in Ontario do so without a leader. But when you plug in any of the people who are going to be running for leader, except for maybe John Tory, although he hasn't said he would run, the Liberal support tanks. I saw one poll putting a leaderless Liberal Party in Ontario at 33, but a Liberal Party led by Del Duca at 19. And therefore Andrea Horwath jumps to first place. So the challenge now is that the federal Liberals seem to be benefiting from the Ontario NDP's good work. And I don't know if that's just because people are defaulting to where they voted in 2015, but I think the Ontario NDP is doing a good job. The Ford government has never gone more than a few days, it seems, without something of at least a moderate scandal. Yeah, the almighty huge. Quebec overall is the most social democratic province. I would say so. There's some exceptions. I mean, some of the western provinces, even though they're sometimes governed by conservative governments, have certain elements that were forged during the CCF NDP days, like public auto insurance and government ownership. But I would say that Quebec is similar to some of those provinces in that they have high levels of unionization. They have pharmacare in a sense. They have public daycare. I would say that it's probably, at least on economic terms, the most social democratic province. I would say so. That's probably a fair point. Yeah. Jambiro, made me think of Harper's Netflix video. Yeah, Harper's like, I enjoy Netflix, sounding like the most robotic fraud ever. But the reality is that he was trying to make the argument that the Liberals or the NDP were going to create this Netflix tax, when at the end of the day, all it would ever be is just taxing Netflix like you tax any other company. Netflix isn't like bread or milk or eggs. It's not a necessity. So you should pay sales tax on it. You should, right? And so if you buy Crave... Sorry, somebody's got a motorcycle outside here. If you guys hear that rumbling. If you guys buy Crave, does anybody hear of Crave? You pay taxes on Crave. But you don't pay taxes on Netflix. So in effect, Canada is subsidizing one of the biggest companies in the world, while its Canadian competitors have to pay the tax. That's just not fair. It's not fair. So I think but the narrative was like, oh, it's a tax, so it's bad. Yeah, Joshua, that's a good point. Quebec does have higher taxes than a lot of provinces, but you get a lot for it. So I get what they're saying. And again, I think it goes to what I was saying, that Canadian media companies have to pay the tax, and they're a lot smaller and less profitable than Netflix. So I think that it makes sense for a lot of people to say, hey, our media companies are suffering, and yet Netflix is the one that gets the effective subsidy from the government. It's no different than if the federal government sales tax is 5%. In effect, the federal government is giving a 5% subsidy to Netflix. and they're not giving it to Canadian companies. Joshua, if Bernie and Warren teamed up for real, they would destroy the competition. Warren would be an awesome as Bernie's VP. I think so too. I think that Bernie would be a great ticket, at least ideologically. But there's a couple barriers to that ticket. One, I think Bernie might feel... Let's operate under the assumption that Bernie ends up winning. Well, if Warren ends up winning, she won't pick Bernie. Because Bernie's quite a bit older, and it doesn't make sense to have such an older person be your VP. I don't think it does. I think Bernie might take up a role in her administration, play a key role, but I don't think she would make him vice president. She would pick somebody else. Maybe a man, maybe a person of color, but I think she would pick somebody else. Bernie might pick someone else as well. I think Bernie would be under pressure to pick someone young, but I think Bernie would almost certainly pick a woman. Another challenge for them picking one another is they're both left-wing people from northeastern United States, from deep blue areas of the country. And it might be felt that somebody from a more moderate region or somebody from a different part of the country would be a good idea. It might be the case also that, like, say Bernie wins, maybe Elizabeth Warren doesn't want to be president. Maybe she wants a different role. Maybe she wants to be a key member of Bernie's cabinet in a position she feels she could do more good than as vice president. Who knows, right? So I don't know if that'll end up being the ticket. Ideologically, you're right. It'd be a great ticket. I don't know if it will be, though. Hammock Lady, is the Green Party centrist? I've not been getting much information from that front from Google. I would say yes. I would say that they're a pretty centrist party. Sometimes they're to the right of the Liberals, and sometimes they're to the left of the Liberals, depending on the time and the province and the issue at hand. The Green Party itself has their slogan being not left, not right, but forward. And by saying that, they're basically admitting that they belong in the center. Now, the average Green voter is not a centrist. The average Green voter is pretty left of center. There was a study by Abacus done a little bit ago, I talked about this in one of my recent videos, that said, if you're a Green voter and you had to vote for another party that wasn't the Greens, who would you vote for? And overwhelmingly, they said the NDP. It was like 40% or something. So a lot of Green voters are left of center people. The Green Party itself, though, is, I think, quite centrist. Whether it's the fact that in British Columbia, they have good environmental issues, but they don't, for instance, they've slowed down the minimum wage increase, and they've prevented the NDP from passing certain labor reforms, or here in Ontario, they voted with Doug Ford against the right to strike for some workers, or it's Elizabeth May effectively wanting to allow a corporation to build water service for Indigenous people. Now, she says it's not privatization, but we know that SNC-Lavalin, even if they were forced to do it as part of a crime, reparation, that they would get some value from it. They support some higher taxes, but not in the way the NDP does. I would say they're a centrist party. I would say so. That atheist bastard, you say, what are the differences between Canada's election cycle and the United States? Which do you prefer? There's a whole bunch of differences. One, you guys have the perpetual campaign. If I can explain it this way, leave out provincial and state politics. We'll leave those out. At the federal level in the United States, you guys have elections every 2 years. Because your Congress, your House gets elected every 2 years, your senators every 6 years, roughly about a third of the Senate each time, and the president every 4 years. So every 2 years you have an election. In Canada, we have an election no fewer than once every 5 years. But it depends. A majority government, aka a government where one party has over half the seats, so in a legislature of 300, they would have at least 151 seats. They can effectively govern for the whole 5 years. But governments can fall earlier, and minorities especially, if the ruling party loses the confidence of the House, aka the other parties vote against it on a key piece of legislation. And so often you'll see governments, elections less time then. We don't have perpetual campaigning in Canada. With a majority government like right now, we're sort of in election mode because we know the election's going to be in October, almost certainly in October, but our election periods usually only formally last a couple months, usually a few weeks, sometimes 6-7 weeks. And so it's a much more junctured system. I would say our system is probably a bit better. The once every 2 year Congress cycle means that congressional people can never not be campaigning, and it creates this pressure to fundraise, and I think it limits their ability to actually be responsive and effective as representatives and as legislators. I think that the American system, though, I think gives much more scrutiny throughout the years. And one thing about the American system is that there's broader participation within the parties. In Canada, a very, 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 very small portion of people actually get involved in deciding who runs for which party. Whereas the United States, you guys have primaries. And I know turnout for them is low, but they're much higher than they are for Canadian systems. Our party systems are much more closed memberships than this thing that you openly declare to. And I think the American system offers a sort of openness that our system doesn't. You have to be a member of the party, and you have to, you pay your dues, and you have to go to the thing, and it's very different. It's very different, much more closed off than the American system. Alex, I think one thing you have to do at this stage is that we're still learning how to deal with digital picket lines. We're still learning how to deal with that reality. I think you just have to do your best. No one's perfect. It's not always easy to tell. Like with Amazon, it's like certain websites require Amazon digital services in the background to run, and you can't always tell which ones use Amazon's AWS or whatever. So it's technically, as that crossing a picket line? I don't know. You have to just do your best. So what my point was, when there's a labor dispute going on and you know about it, just like you shouldn't cross a picket line at your local factory or at your local grocery store or what have you, you shouldn't cross a picket line digitally. So if Amazon workers are on strike or Uber workers are on strike or Lyft workers are on strike, don't cross their picket line. And that was my overarching point. More than anything specifically. Just do your best is my point. Like, we have to get used to the philosophy that digital picket lines are real. And once we do that, there'll be more attention paid to them. I think it's just people need to even start thinking of them as picket lines. Oh, that is DAZN? Okay. Bob Forbes, tough question. Why isn't NDP more vocal in defense of Antifa and similar organizing efforts? I think some MPs have certainly offered support. Antifa, I think, is been very much demonized, and I don't agree with all the tactics of all Antifa. I know there's not Antifa. There's not an Antifa headquarters. That's not how Antifa works. I'm not always in agreement with their tactics, but I feel like in general they're good. But I can see why politicians are hesitant to stand up for something, because on the one hand you could say, well, Antifa isn't one solid organization, therefore it's hard to say that it's some broad national thing. But I'll tell you what, that makes it very hard for a political party to offer support to something. How can you offer support to something that by definition has a bit of unpredictability to it? And that might be what makes Antifa effective, but it makes them risky politically. So from my perspective, I can see why groups don't want to associate with Antifa, especially because if one random group of people claiming to be Antifa do something, then you'll be tarred and feathered for it. I think the NDP more credibly, and I think we need to be doing more of this, is talking about BDS. The NDP is amongst the Canadian parties, the only party that seems to defend the right of people to support BDS. Liberals and conservatives are so anti-Palestine that they want to almost make it a crime to say you shouldn't buy stuff from Israel. The NDP is the only party that really says, look, we might not agree with BDS, but we agree with its right to exist. But I think the NDP needs to be more supportive of the right of Palestinians. I know that might be controversial, but that's my view there. And I think that's more of an organization with some roots that we could support. Bernie may pick Nina Turner. I mean, Nina Turner would be a good pick for a lot of reasons. It's a woman of color. It would really throw a wrench in all those people that say Bernie doesn't care about people of color. But I don't know if you pick Nina Turner necessarily. She's still fairly young. She's relatively low profile. I wonder if, and I don't know if he should do this, but I wonder if he'll pick somebody like Stacey Abrams. She's more of a centrist, but I wonder if he'll go and he'll pick like a relatively centrist person to try to do that, and pick someone like Stacey Abrams, who's a woman of color and has a high profile, and I might pick someone like that. Whether we on this stream agree with that or not, I think he might do something like that. I'm not sure. In any case, I don't want Bernie worrying about VP picks yet. He's got to worry about, winning those first few states, and then we could talk about VPs. I mean, some people want him to pick Tulsi Gabbard. Problem with Tulsi is she's got a lot of skeletons, and those are certainly going to come out if she gets picked. I think that Nina Turner would be a great vice president, but I don't know if tactically she'll be seen as the pick. I'm not sure. I mean, Joshua, Antifa is pretty decentralized. It's more of a vision for hating fascism than any kind of coherent organization. And some people like Antifa for that, and some people don't. But to blow it up to be this conspiracy against conservatives is very disingenuous. You're right. It's nothing. It's not a strict organization. And Bob, I think that's a fair point. But but that's a nuanced position. Media doesn't like nuance. Media will often take nuance and find the point that makes you look bad of that nuance and say you're not nuanced, right? So I totally get you. And on my 1.5 hour stream, where I'm not running for office, we can have discussions about this. But if I need a 30-second soundbite saying Antifa is good in a sense, but they also have some tactics I don't agree with, media's not going to want that. They're going to want a yes, no, maybe so answer. In some cases, then, it's just better to ignore the question. I think from a political reality. Yeah, BMBC 1310. Most neoliberal shills hate Nina Turner and dismiss her identity because it doesn't suit them. They do that to every Bernie supporter that isn't a young white man. When an older white woman or a young black woman or Hispanic people or anybody supports Bernie Sanders that doesn't fit the narrative, they dismiss it, because the narrative has to be that Bernie doesn't care about racial or gender justice, when nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. Bernie has been a longtime champion of women, of people of color, of LGBTQ2S peoples, more than anybody else on that stage. Could Bernie in almost all of those issues, right? And so they have to basically lie. And when the numbers refute their lies, then they have to just become shills and say, well, that's a flawed study, or these people are fake, or that person is a puppet for Bernie Sanders. Real women of color don't support Bernie, etc., etc., etc. It's gotten old, and I think that worked in 2016. I don't think it's working right now, though. I think people are seeing that Bernie Sanders actually has significant amount of support amongst African Americans. He's not leading, but amongst young black people, he has a lot of support. And I've seen some polls saying that he's leading among Hispanics, at least. So Bernie does have significant support amongst non-white Americans. And I think Bernie, Nina Turner is a good example of just how Bernie has put into great positions of influence women of color. And I think that's incredibly important. Bob, don't worry about it. Yeah, I try to answer as many as I can. If I miss a question, sometimes I miss them. If I give a really long answer or there's a quick flurry. If I did miss one of yours, I'm really sorry. Maybe just fire it off again and I'll catch it. I do want to make sure that I get to all of them. This is one of the benefits of being on a stream like mine. I'm not a big fancy YouTuber, but I do have enough time that I can answer all your questions. So in doing that, I think it's a good place to be. The Almighty Huge, yeah, we're treating elections like a TV show. Yeah, we are. We are to a certain degree. And I mean, and the TV networks, and this is Canada too, the TV networks controlling the debates rather than just filming them and putting them out there, I think is problematic. There's been a lot of discussions, and I talked about this, that the neoliberals like Delaney and Biden and Hickenlooper and stuff, they were awful. But the CNN questions were very much framed in a right-wing direction. And those CNN debates, were during the commercials had like pro-pharmaceutical company commercials on and like anti-healthcare for all commercials on. And so you could tell that the financial interests of the parent company of CNN is not what Bernie Sanders and not what Elizabeth Warren believe. And so I think that, there needs to be a more unbiased way to have these debates shown, where maybe they're held on, maybe the party themselves puts the debate on, and all the television networks can run it, but the structure is less influenced by media companies that are owned by anti-progressive forces. Yeah, bashing. Yeah. They bash her because her husband's a cop. I mean, that's a tricky one, right? I mean, a lot of people have legitimate criticisms of police, but I think it's, ironically for a lot of people who call Bernie and his team sexist, I think it's a little sexist to judge a woman in relation to her husband's career. I think that, I think that's unfair, right? A lot of people did that to Hillary Clinton, and I wasn't a Hillary supporter, but when you try to put people would try to blame Hillary for some of Bill's things, and some of the things Bill did were she supported, but they tried to basically give all of Bill Clinton's sins to her, and that was kind of misogynistic, even if you didn't like Hillary Clinton. So I think that if you're going to attack Nina Turner, you have to do it on substance, on her perspective. Astro Frost asks, Christo, what do you think of a national voter registration drive by the Sanders campaign? Seems like the best way to expand the electorate. I think that's a good idea. I think it's a good way to get people signed up. As you register people, you can also get them in your database. I think it's a good PR move because it shows that whether they vote for you or not, you just want, say, young people and marginalized people to vote and to have their voice heard. I think it's good for Bernie because I think Bernie is going to be successful amongst some of the populations that vote less. That's going to be one of Bernie's challenges, is that young people love him, poor people love him, but poor people and young people don't vote as much, right? And so what do you do about that? You got to get them registered. I think longer term, I think the move has to go towards automatic voter registration. That when you turn 18, and I actually think it should be 16, but when you turn 18, you should be automatically registered to vote. And then if you want to deregister for ideological or religious or whatever reasons, you can go to your government and do that. But you should be automatically registered to vote. That's what I believe. Everyone should be registered. Or you should have it like Canada, where you can do same-day registration at the polls. And I know some states allow that, but others don't. To me, there should be never... If you can... Like in Canada, if you have a voter card, because you were registered, you can just go. But if you can go to a poll on the day of with proof that you live in that jurisdiction, like a telephone bill, a bill from your bank or what have you, you can vote. And that's how it should be. Joshua's... Yeah, they love Kamala Harris for being a cop, so that's a double standard then, BMBC 1310. I mean, a lot of people are critical for Kamala Harris. That's Kamala Harris's big weakness right now politically. One, yeah, her flip-flopping on Medicare for All is a big deal, but a lot of people are concerned because when she was, had a lot of power over the criminal justice system in the biggest state in the United States. It basically has the population of Canada, California. She didn't do enough to fight for racial justice. So now, when Kamala Harris says she wants to fight against Trump's inhumane conditions and she criticizes Joe Biden for his support of segregationists, what is she going to say when she locked up young black men overwhelmingly for marijuana when she herself did the drug? Or what are they going to say about the use of prison labor at less than minimum wages and what all of these sorts of things? She had a chance to effectively end the death penalty in California and chose not to. I think that really hurts her. And that's why, Tulsi Gabbard, in a minute, utterly demolished Kamala Harris. You guys remember that moment of the debate when she said, she brought up the points I just brought up. Kamala Harris could say nothing. And after the debate, Kamala Harris was like, well, I didn't say anything because I'm not going to respond to somebody polling at 2%, which was not a good look for her. Because, Tulsi Gabbard, I don't think has a chance of winning this primary, but she's still on that stage, and you have to treat her with respect. And that wasn't respectful. Joshua says, future generations will look back at these media people whose words are recorded and preserved and grown. This could be a famous time of misinformation for historians. I think that's a fair point. Historians have often looked at media, and one of the things I can say as a historian is that we have a lot of talk today about fake news as this new thing, but news has always sort of been fake in some ways. There's always been a discourse about news being ideologically driven or politically driven or financially driven or narratives being crafted to achieve certain things. Like, when the U.S. used media reports to justify an invasion of Spain in the late early 1900s. That was an example. Media can be used to do a lot of those things. So, yeah, I think, though, that because we have so much footage from nowadays, you're right that, the conduct of the mainstream media and how they responded to Bernie Sanders, or in some cases just ignored him when it suited their interests, could be a very interesting case study for those who study journalism and study the history of media in the future. Why you gotta flex on my boy John Delaney? Here's the thing. John Delaney doesn't have the worst ideas. He supports a capital gains tax increase. That's a good idea. But, his only reason to be on that stage was, I think, to basically say we shouldn't be as bold as Warren and Sanders. And I don't think he's actually there to be president. So he's sort of just there to critique the left. And I felt like it's not really why are you here? Andrew Yang isn't going to win, but he's there for a reason. I don't agree with his form of basic income, but he's there to champion it. And as such, he belongs on that stage. Some people are there because they represent certain issues or certain regions. But Delaney, I don't see the reason. It's anything Delaney does, Joe Biden can do, and Joe Biden's polling at 40. You don't need Biden and Ryan and Hickenlooper and I'm forgetting some of the other neoliberals. So that's just my view. Yeah, the only donation Steve Mnuchin made to a Democrat was Kamala. That's not a good look, right? Sometimes it's hard. You get donations from people, although sometimes politicians, they've gotten donations from certain people or companies or groups and they've returned them because they don't want to be associated. I think that is a very interesting perspective of who donates to who. And you can see why Bernie, a video I put out today, go watch that after this stream if you haven't seen it, where we talk about how Bernie has the broadest and deepest support. And I think that's important. Donors are a good measure of a lot of things. And individual donors can matter too. Here in Canada, it's billionaires in Canada often donate to both the Liberals and Conservatives, but seemingly never to the NDP. And there's a reason why that is. It's because the NDP has a vision that's not very friendly to billionaires, while the Liberals and Conservatives have pro-billionaire agendas. Yeah, wasting $15 million to own the libs. If you have the money, I don't know. I'm a big supporter of a wealth tax, but he could have just bought another private jet or 3. But I guess he's I guess I'll run for president. There are worse ways to waste your money. Maybe I don't know. I don't know, But yeah, yeah. Yang is here to warn us not even be president. I mean, again, whether you agree with Yang or not, I mean, some people run for president to be president. Some people run for president to bring mainstream eyes to an issue. Some people run for president so that they can be vice president or can find a cabinet position to raise their national profile. And some people do it for a mix of all three. And I think Delaney, I don't know what his reason is. I don't know. Yeah, you know, he's not a super young guy, so I don't know. Like, is he gonna like a younger like Julian Castro running this time isn't necessarily going to be president, but maybe he feels his time to be president is in 8 years from now, and now he needs to start planting that seed, though. Manuel Lopez Diaz, I know Bernie is in the lead, and according to some polls, but I'm scared they'll might steal it from him like last time. There's a few things there. I mean, I'm not going to say that they won't be rigged. I can't promise that. What I can say, though, is a couple things. One, the polling averages put Biden quite a bit ahead of Bernie right now. We don't want to talk about that, but Biden's got a big lead. In some cases, the gap between Biden and Bernie is bigger than the gap between Bernie and Kamala Harris / Elizabeth Warren. The polling averages that I've seen have put Bernie in the mid-high 20s, but Biden in the low 40s, maybe high 30s. Biden's got a big lead right now. We might have to, unless that changes, Biden might run away with this. I hope that's not the case. But a factor of why it will be harder to steal from Bernie this time is when it was just Hillary versus Bernie, you could kind of rig it for one person and know you're rigging it for that person. But if it's Bernie versus Warren versus Booker versus Harris versus Biden versus Buttigieg versus O'Rourke and on and on and on, you know, it's going to be very tricky to stack the deck in favor of one person without unintended consequences. So I think that this is a different context, and I think that's a good thing for Bernie. If it was Bernie versus Biden one-on-one, then I think you might see a similar profile to 2016. Any thoughts on Yang's UBI? I don't like it. I think it's not a UBI. If you want a UBI, it needs to be a basic income at minimum. I don't know what that is in the United States, but I think it needs to probably be at least double what it is. What does it take to survive for the average American? Rent, food, and everything. If you cannot get rent, food, and basic necessities, then it is a basic income. He can call it something else, but it's not a basic income. A basic income to me would need to be at least, $25,000 a year in the United States? $20,000 a year? So it's not a basic income. His framing is very conservative. I support the idea of a basic income, like the theoretical idea, but as it would be implemented by Yang, I don't support it. I don't support it at all. Oh, Manuel Lopez here. My wife Priscilla says hi. She said hi last time. Tell her I say hi again. Not all the polls say Biden's in the lead. You're right, Manuel. But if you look at if you go to the debate page on Wikipedia, to determine who gets into the debates, they use an aggregate of I think 30 polls. And what they do is they aggregate those polls to determine. You needed a certain minimum amount of percent. They also use that to ensure that they spread out the candidates. So that's why Bernie and Biden weren't on the stage together in that second one, because they were the top two candidates. Now, when you aggregate the polls, Biden is ahead right now. And that's just on the average. Now, the nature of these polls is that we never know how polling actually is. We're a long ways away from even the first vote, and that maybe all the polls, maybe the polling average is wrong, and one of the polls that has Bernie up in front ends up being the right one. But on average, Biden is leading, and that's just my point. I don't want that to be the case, but it is the case. Alex Brown, what do you just think about a robot tax? Well, I support a wealth tax. A robot tax seems like a terrible idea to me, even if they are presented as similar, if not the same to people. No, I don't really support a robot tax. I mean, my view is that automation is good and we should encourage it, but the fruits of that automation should be owned by the people. I don't think you need a robot tax specifically. I think you need a wealth tax to tax the extremely wealthy people who benefit from automation. I think you need corporate taxes to tax corporations that are very profitable because of automation. And I think you need capital gains taxes to tax the shareholders who gain such great value from those companies that are automated. I think a specific robot tax misses the mark. Because the roots of inequality today are not just automation related, even though automation plays a big role. I think you just need to higher capital gains, higher wealth, higher inheritance, higher corporate, and higher income taxes. And policies that make it, that encourage public and cooperative and worker ownership of industry. Joshua, you're right. $1,000 a month is a lot easier to start at, but it's not a basic income. To me, the idea of a basic income is it's basic. It's what you need to survive. So for me, what a basic income would be is a place to live for one person, let's say a one-bedroom apartment, with a month of food, with the food you need. And to me, basic necessities include like a phone, like a standard smartphone with internet connection, because internet's required, and your utilities. Those are basics to me. You need to be able to cover all of that. And I know that in some cities that's very expensive, but even I can't think of anywhere in the United States where $1,000 a month is going to cover all of that without you having to make significant sacrifices, which means it's not a basic income. Now, some states like Alaska have they call it something else. They call it like a universal dividend. If he wants to call it that, then that's fine. But it's not a basic income. It's not at all. It won't actually solve the issues that he's talking about. Yeah, Manuel. I mean, I agree. The point is that on aggregate, Bernie is still behind Biden. Now, Bernie is beating Biden in fundraising, both amount raised and donors, and he's got a better distribution of that money and of those donors. But Biden's still leading right now in the polling. Now, again, it doesn't have to stay that way. It might not be that the aggregate is right. It might be that the Bernie favored polls are right. That's just from what I've seen. I probably would say probably Broadbent of those ones. Definitely not Leighton. I like Jack, but Jack was too centrist for me. Pre 1984 Broadbent was very left wing. I don't know if you guys have read the Party of Conscience, which is a book I was in, where I talked about Lewis and Broadbent and Tommy Douglas and how they were real, anti-capitalists when they led the federal party. So I would probably back Ed Broadbent. David Lewis was very good as well, but when he could have become prime minister, he was probably of a bit of an advanced age. So if I had to pick them when they were prominent, Ed Broadbent would have been a very young prime minister. He would have been in his late 30s, early 40s, and it would have been very exciting. Prime Minister Tommy Douglas would have been very good as well. But yeah, those two over Leighton. I mean, Joshua again, if he sold it as a universal dividend, maybe that would be better represented. I think if you sell a basic income as, here's what we're going to do. We're going to tax the rich at 90%, and we're going to literally give the poorest people in our society what it takes to effectively earn, to stay above the poverty line. We're going to give every single person a guarantee out of poverty. That's to me the basic income. Now we can do that, but the only way we're going to do that is if we radically tax the wealthy and even the upper middle class. And I am willing to do that. But the neoliberals don't want to do that because they actually don't believe in a basic income. A basic income it might have to be $25,000 a year for every man, woman, and child. Or $20,000 a year for every man, woman, and child. Not $1,000 a month for every adult. And so that's my view. If you're going to be bold, if Andrew Yang wants... Because here's the thing. Andrew Yang doesn't actually support a basic income. With his whole, not left, not right, but forward, he's too centrist to support the real reality of a basic income. A basic income requires the destruction of capitalism in a sense. Because you really do need a radically equal society. Maybe you need a society where the richest person can only have a salary 7 or 8 or 9 times higher than the basic income. Maybe that's what you need. Maybe if the basic income is $20,000 a year, the richest person can only make $200,000 a year. And then after that, they're taxed at 100%. Maybe that's what we need. Because otherwise, I don't see the path forward. So those people who, I understand they're trying to sell something to the masses, but if you really support a basic income, support a basic income. And that's my perspective. And be ready to build what people are going to call a communist society. Because that's what it's going to take. So I'm just going to take a few more questions. I'm probably going to wrap up around 8. My voice is getting a little hoarse, but I do have a few more questions here. BMBC asks, how are Jugmeat's debating skills, Christo? So much changes in the last month before election. The platform is pretty decent, but the TV performances change polls faster than anything. No, you're right. The election period is when more people are going to start paying attention. Right now, a lot of regular people, like we're all political junkies. You guys are watching some guy with 2,600 subscribers talk politics on a Friday night of a long weekend. We love politics. Most Canadians, though, they're not really there on politics yet. They'll start paying attention after Labor Day, I would say. That's what happened in 2011. That was a really long election, but it was after Labor Day that a lot of people started really focusing in. So the debates are going to be key. Jugmeat got better and better over the NDP leadership debates, and I think that he's a very bright guy. He's trained as a lawyer. I think he'll be very good at debates. But I don't know. The thing is that he's Trudeau's in an interesting position here because he's the only, except for Elizabeth May, who often didn't get invited to debates, he's the only leader who's done a federal election before. I mean, in 2011, it was Stephen Harper was the only one, except for Elizabeth May, who had been leader longer. So it'll be interesting to see how thing does. I'm hopeful, but it is a bit of a wild card. Although, as we've noted, he's not very well known, and so if he has a good debate performance, much like Jack Layton, who had a good performance, it could really cause a skyrocket in the polls. And this is what happened with Andrea Horwath. In the first debate of the Ontario election, the NDP and the Liberals were basically tied. But Andrea Horwath had a very strong debate, and she basically pulled away from the Liberals, and the Liberals never caught up again. I mean, I can see why people are excited about Yang. I mean, I see why people are excited about a basic income. It's a cool idea. I just don't know if he's the guy to sell it, or if he's selling it right. Firewing 360. I mean, that's an interesting perspective. A lot of people have said, well, a job guarantee is better than a basic income. Maybe you're right in saying that. There's something to be said for a hybrid. That could be an interesting idea. I haven't really thought about the implementation, but that could be an interesting idea, like a hybrid basic income / job guarantee. That's cool. Maybe I'll look into see if somebody's proposed that. Joshua, you're right. Joshua says, I see Yang's angle, whether he is the one to present it or not. These things are changing with technology, and some aspects of society need to adapt in one form or another. I agree. I just don't know if the neoliberal basic income is the way forward, because it doesn't address the core issue. The core issue isn't so much that we need to give people basic income because they can't work. It's that we're not challenging the fundamental assumptions of capitalist ownership, aka, why do these factory owners get to keep all the wealth and they get to give everybody a meager $1,000 a month, and therefore we're all even Steven? Why is the productivity not being shared amongst the workers? Why, instead of a basic income, are we not moving to a 20-hour work week or a 30-hour work week instead of a 40, and for many of us, more than 40-hour work week? Like, there are other discussions to be had that don't necessarily lead to people are unemployable, let's keep them poor, but not super poor. Right? Like, this could tie into the Green New Deal. Like, there's work that needs to be done. Mental and physical work and emotional work that needs to be done. And that's not being done because we've decided that unless a capitalist says that work has value, we don't do it. And so we need to divorce ourselves from that concept. And to me, that's more important than a basic income, just personally. Michael Phelps, I don't understand the question. Is that a Star Trek reference? I'm not sure. What do you think about, Adam B. asks, what do I think about prospective star candidates like Naomi Klein or Avi Lewis, Stephen Page, Kiefer Sutherland? I don't know if any of those people will run. Kiefer would be very interesting. Kiefer's got some issues. He obviously would be Tommy Douglas's grandson. Kiefer Sutherland has a labor dispute right now with IATSE over his film company. So there could be issues there. Avi Lewis and Naomi Klein would be very interesting, but they would be very much attacked for some of their positions. And it could be they could be very much lightning rods for controversy. But maybe that would happen. Stephen Page would be a very good credibility pickup because he's not really ideological, but it's like a sign that like the party is doing really well. I think recently Randy Turtle, he's not a national star, but the chief of the Grassy Narrows First Nation, that's sort of a star candidate in a thematic sense because it shows that it's yet another Indigenous person who's running for the NDP, and the NDP is getting a lot of Indigenous people because the Liberals failed them, and we're working with them. And Grassy Narrows is so emblematic of Trudeau's arrogance. That's where Trudeau, he basically said, thanks for your donation. The Liberal government barely tried to avoid visiting there. And so the NDP getting Indigenous community support, I think, is crucial in that sense. Oh, Sion, and I hope you found that helpful. Again, if you guys, Sion sent me an email just with some advice, and I gave him some advice on some documents. I don't mind doing that for my supporters. I might not be able to answer immediately, but if you ever send me an email, or if you're a Patreon supporter, you can send me a message through Patreon. For those who aren't Patreon supporters and would like to support me on Patreon, you can do that. If you just Google Christo Aivalis Patreon, it'll come up. You can support me there. But I'm always willing to help out folks who have just want some discussion or some advice. At the $10 tier of Patreon, I have a Slack chat. I don't know if anybody is here from that Slack chat, where we just kind of talk about issues and I bounce ideas off people. And if you want to be on the ground floor of some of my changes, as you noticed, I changed my my thumbnails to make them a little bit sharper. Tell me, let me know what you guys think about them, if my new thumbnails are better. But I did that in conjunction with some of the people in my Slack group who gave me some advice about tweaking it. So if you want to be on the ground floor of that, that's at one of my tiers. Strombolopolis, I mean, I'm not sure what he is. I know that during the Great Canadian Debate where they had the Greatest Canadian thing, Strombolopolis was he advocated for Tommy Douglas and he ended up winning. So it would be cool to see Strombolopolis, and I mean, he's a fellow Greek, so it'd be good if Nikki Ashton's a fellow Greek too. They could form a Greek caucus. It would be pretty cool, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if there'll be. I don't know if there's any star candidates coming. So I'm just gonna take the questions that are probably, or if you guys type out something real quick, and then I'm gonna wind the stream down. Comrade Internet, Project Cyber Saiyan needs to come back with a vengeance. Makes this going Super Saiyan look like apex of tranquility. I agree that there needs to be a greater mobilization of modern technology, cybernetics, and things like that for a socialist cause. Michael Rosworski in his book, The Republic of Walmart, and Lee Phillips, they wrote that book, make the case that the way big companies like Amazon and Walmart work has shown that you can actually plan an economy using modern technology, and that those tools could be used in socialist directions. And so I think that's a very novel argument. What do I think of Oprah? I mean, I don't hate Oprah. I mean, she's okay. I mean, she's helped a lot of people. She's entertained a lot of people. There's a certain admiration in the fact that she is an actual person that came from poverty. She's not one of these, like, people who are like, I had nothing growing up, and you find out that their dad gave them $25 million or their uncle gave them $25 million. You know what I mean? So Oprah really did succeed despite the odds. I have a lot of issues with Oprah. I think, like, some of the nature of her stuff is not helpful. She's launched problematic careers of certain people. I think her focus is overwhelmingly on charity and less on needed social reforms. But I mean, I think she's okay as far as rich celebrities go. Comrade Internet, I think that, yeah, you're talking about global, basically space colonization, I think is important. I think we do need to look into that direction. And I think that a lot of times people will say, like, well, we don't have the money on that, we have to fix issues now. I think that we have enough resources that if we were to be more conscious of social and economic planning, that we could both solve poverty and explore space. I do think that that's an option, personally. And I think it would be super cool. So, So I'm just going to take the last two questions here from Lisa and Mark, and then I'm going to wrap up. Lisa says, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I'm looking forward to your next live chat. So, Lisa, actually, I'll just answer your question in a second, and I'll kind of close with you. Mark asks, how does the NDP improve fundraising? It's a good question. It's something we need to work on. I think part of the challenge is like some people, NDP supporters, maybe need to be a bit more generous. I know a lot of us have a whole lot of money, but even somebody who says makes $45,000 a year could donate a little bit more. I think that we have some people who should be donating a little bit more. But in terms of what the party could do, I mean, I think that they need to tie our vision to fundraising in a way that they don't really currently do. They need to go to people like Bernie does and say, look, the mainstream media is against us. The financial elite is against us. They don't want our vision because our vision challenges their unearned privilege. But we can't do it through like the liberals or conservatives because we don't have big donors. I think the NDP needs to push the narrative that Bernie did, the $20, $30 donation, and really make hay off that. An opportunity was, a few weeks ago, there was that smear piece by in the Huffington Post where they said Jagmeet Singh isn't fundraising, when really it was like Jagmeet Singh isn't holding exclusive, you have to pay to get in fundraisers, which is a good thing. And I think that Jagmeet Singh should have taken that opportunity and said, people are saying the NDP isn't working hard to raise money, when the reality is that we just don't want to raise money from connected insiders. So we need your help. Send Jagmeet Singh and the NDP a $20 donation today. And like that's an accessible amount of money. And by doing that, you could like tie our need for money to a resistance to the corporate nature of an elite nature of fundraising. And that's what I did. I actually had a tweet where I tweeted out like in celebration of that attack piece, I donated $19, which was at the time Bernie Sanders' average donation for this campaign. And a few other people did it too. So I think that's something we need to see more of. And so Lisa Lisa just was the first one here, so we'll close with Lisa when we say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I'm looking forward to your next live chat. Again, next week we do have our Wednesday chat. Brianna won't be back from I don't believe she'll be back from her trip yet. She's currently away. If she is, she'll probably help to host. If not, I'll just do it like this again. But we'll certainly do that. Maybe I'll do another stream before then. It'll probably be something more impromptu like this one. But I'm glad you guys came. Again, if you want to see, if you're new for whatever reason, check out my videos. If you enjoyed this content, consider supporting me on Patreon. Again, I know not everybody has the means or ability, but your support on Patreon is super helpful. And other than that, just let people know about this content if you like it and you think they'll like it too. So guys, have a great one, and I'll see you in the next stream.